Hello, I'm Byron Brown. I've been a lawyer for almost 20 years. Because of my appearance, my speech, McDonald's just didn't give a f***, and my delivery, I'm known as the anti-lawyer lawyer. I deliver legal analysis on anything and everything. Today, I'm going to talk about fighting in professional sports, specifically why we don't see more athletes face criminal charges for their behavior on the rink or the field. Fighting has entertained and fascinated people for centuries, from the fighting in the Colosseums to fighting in cages. Fighting also exists to varying degrees in the 4 major professional sports. Why don't we see more players in professional sports charged with criminal charges? Each professional sport league has different rules and collective bargaining agreements that deal with fighting and violence. A player can throw a baseball 100 miles an hour and hit another player in the face, and there's no criminal charges. A player can hurl his body towards another player as they're moving quickly and violently cause that player to land on his head and suffer serious injuries, and there's no criminal charges. A player can punch another player in the face, causing serious injuries, and there's no criminal charges. So what happens that makes fighting and/or violence legal in professional sports when that same behavior would be illegal in regular society? If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Well, there are 3 main issues that need to be analyzed: consent, scope of the consent, and the legal system itself. When anybody participates in any type of sporting event, they consent to certain risk, certain danger, and certain physical conduct. For example, when a person participates in baseball, they consent to a baseball being thrown in their direction. They know this. They consent to a baseball possibly hitting and injuring them. They don't want it, but they know it. This is when they agree to participate, that they consent to this danger. This is also known as assumption of the risk, meaning when someone participates in a given sporting event, they assume risk. Sticking with the baseball analogy, when one participates in baseball, they assume the risk of getting hit by a baseball. This does not mean that when someone participates in a given sport, that the person consents to every danger that anyone could possibly dream of when playing the given sport. So what is the scope of consent and/or the assumption of risk? Well, the scope of consent and/or assumption of risk is what a normal, reasonable person would consent to under similar circumstances. Meaning, a normal, reasonable person would understand and appreciate that being hit by a baseball, even say hit in the head by a baseball, is within the scope of consent. On the other hand, I do not believe a normal, reasonable person would believe the scope of consent in playing baseball means that you consent to be stabbed. Hockey is well known for having fights. Almost every day a hockey game is played, there's a fight. Therefore, if you play hockey, you consent. You assume the risk of being in a possible fight. But then the question is, what is the scope of that consent? How much risk do you assume? Does a hockey player consent to getting punched in the back of the head, knocked out, and injuries including 3 fractured neck vertebrae? As we will see in the case of Todd Bertuzzi and Steve Moore, the answer is clearly no. And the legal system itself is flawed. Fighting and violence that happens in professional sports is legal. Would it be criminal if it happened in everyday life? Yes. However, sport is not everyday life. When prosecutors and police consider laying charges, they must consider whether they believe that they can get a jury to convict of the charges that they lay. When you think of it in this fashion, you see another reason why athlete-on-athlete violence does not lead to criminal charges. Because most people that would be actual jurors, are likely going to look at consent, assumption of risk, and the scope of that consent, and the scope of the assumption of risk. And if prosecutors and police believe that a normal person would sit on that jury and they wouldn't convict because these athletes consent to a certain level of violence, they assume so much of a risk, then the prosecutor and police they're not going to lay the charges. This is compounded by the problem that most athletes that participate in violent sports would not testify or support criminal charges against their adversary. Meaning, it is very unlikely that a pitcher in baseball who intentionally throws a ball and hits a batter is likely going to turn around and testify and provide support for charges laid against that batter, who may end up charging the mound and punching the pitcher in the face. If there are no supporting witnesses, then the prosecution and police simply don't have a case. So yes, consent, assumption of risk, and scope all play a large part in criminal charges not being laid for a violent act that causes injury in a sporting event. This is compounded by the fact that participants of the sport abide by a code. What happens on the field, on the ice, between the lines, stays on the field, stays on the ice, and stays between the lines. No police, No court of law, no criminal charges. They police themselves. I'm going to walk through each of the 4 professional sports leagues, outline rules and collective bargaining agreements that each dictate how fighting and violence is governed. I'll do this by looking at real-life historic examples that have played out in each of the professional sports leagues.
If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel.
Let's start with basketball. The National Basketball Association rules cover everything from game etiquette to fighting. The NBA's CBA, collective bargaining agreement, does not outline any type of punishment for fighting or violence. It leaves it to the NBA rules. So let's look to the rules. Specifically, Rule 12, entitled Fouls and Penalties. Section 6 of Fouls and Penalties, fighting fouls, states, a technical foul shall be assessed to players, coaches, or trainers for fighting. No free throws, and the participant will be ejected immediately. It goes on to permit a $50,000 fine and a suspension imposed by the commissioner at his sole discretion. The NBA commissioner has wide discretion to assess penalties for player conduct off and on the court. When a fight or violence occurs in an NBA game, the NBA commissioner has sole discretion to issue suspensions of any length, and issue fines up to and including $50,000. One of, if not the most notorious example of this in the NBA is the Malice at the Palace. The Malice at the Palace occurred on November 19th, 2004. The Indiana Pacers were playing the defending NBA champions Detroit Pistons. With 45.9 seconds left, Pistons' Ben Wallace attempted a layup when Pacers' Ron Artest fouled Wallace from behind by slapping him in the back of the head. Wallace shoved Artest and a small fight ensued. The fight was broken up. Artest was agitated. He laid down on a timekeeper's table. Some people think that was meant to incite violence. However, it was later learned that Artest would lay down when he was experiencing being agitated in an attempt to calm down. This is when a fan threw a drink at Artest, which resulted in Artest and other players entering the stands, fighting with fans, fighting with each other, and throwing objects at each other. Criminal charges resulted, but none of those criminal charges related to any conduct occurred prior to the drink being thrown. Meaning, the contact between Wallace and Artest was not seen as rising to the level of criminal conduct because being fouled is common within basketball. Further, a physical confrontation with any player during a basketball game is common within basketball. And if it's common, then it's within the scope of consent. Wallace and Artest both consented to possibly being struck in the head during a basketball game, possibly being shoved by other players during the basketball game, and possibly fighting with another player during a basketball game. However, it was not seen to be within the scope of consent or assumption of risk for a melee to ensue that involved players, staff from the Pacers and the Pistons, spectators, and objects being thrown. Even though fights break out in stands involving spectators, and even though we've seen players get into physical altercations with spectators, we do not see it in such frequency that anyone is going to believe that it's within the scope of any athlete's consent. It is too rare, too infrequent. Ron Artest, Stephen Jackson, Jermaine O'Neal, and Anthony Johnson all faced criminal charges, and they all received very similar criminal punishments, which included a year probation, an allotment of hours of community service, and anger management. Additionally, they all received suspensions from the NBA. Ron Artest was hit the hardest. He was suspended for the remainder of the season, which included 73 regular season games, 13 playoff games, and a forfeiture of almost $5 million in salary. Stephen Jackson was suspended 30 games and forfeited almost $2 million in salary. Jermaine O'Neal was suspended 15 games and forfeited over $4 million in salary. And Anthony Johnson was suspended 5 games and forfeited over $100,000 in salary. So the lesson learned from the Malice at the Palace is to keep the fighting and violence on the court between the players and do not use foreign objects. If NBA players can comply with this criteria, then it's very unlikely that we'll see any of them face criminal charges for conduct that stays on the basketball court, that is between player themselves and does not involve any foreign objects. Just like the next example that occurred in 1977. On December 9th, 1977, the Houston Rockets were playing the Los Angeles Lakers. A scuffle broke out between Kevin Kurnet and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the backcourt. Kermit Washington stayed back to ensure nothing serious happened to the Lakers star and his teammate, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kunit's Houston Rockets teammate, Rudy Tomjanovich, who was known as a peacemaker throughout the NBA, started to run back in Kunit and Kareem's direction. Washington saw this, and he thought maybe Tomjanovich was a possible threat to Kareem, so he sucker punched. He sucker punched Tomjanovich right in the face as Tomjanovich was running towards him. The force broke Tomjanovich's jaw, nose, and he also had spinal fluid leaking to such a degree he could taste it in his mouth. What happened to Washington? Washington got fined 10 grand, suspended 60 days. The reason Washington was not criminally charged, I believe, is because the case happened in the 1970s. If what happened on December 9th, 1977 between Washington and Tomjanovich happened today, I believe Washington would face criminal charges. No NBA player consents to being sucker punched. Sure, this involved two players, and following the logic that we just discussed to the malice of the palace, if the violence occurs on the court between two players and does not involve foreign objects, criminal charges would be unlikely. But remember, I said these situations are always fact specific. In this case, the difference is the seriousness of the injuries and the unprovoked surprise attack. If this matter involved two NBA players that squared up and had a consensual fight, and the same injuries resulted, I don't believe we'd see any criminal charges. However, if one player sucker punched an unsuspecting player and the same injuries occurred, there is no consent, there's no assumption of risk. And in today's social climate, the jury would very likely agree with my analysis and convict a player guilty of a sucker punch. From a sucker punch to a sucker pitch. We see in baseball, when one looks through Major League Baseball rules, the word fight or fighting does not appear. Opposite to the NBA, where the NBA rules govern the punishment of fighting and violence, the MLB rules direct our attention to the MLB CBA. The MLB CBA Article 9, discipline. Under that article, subsection A, just cause, states, and this is very general, wide latitude for the commissioner. The parties recognize that a player may be subject to disciplinary action for just cause by his club, the chief baseball officer, or the commissioner. Therefore, in grievances regarding discipline, the issue to be resolved shall be whether there has been just cause for the penalty imposed. Additionally, the MLB CBA has another relevant subsection, subsection B, entitled Conduct Detrimental or Prejudicial to Baseball. It states, players may be disciplined for just cause, for conduct that is materially detrimental or materially prejudicial to the best interest of baseball, including but not limited to engaging in conduct in violation of federal, state, or local law, convicted of a crime, basically. The commissioner and a club shall not discipline a player for the same conduct under this provision. In cases of this type, a club may only discipline a player or take other adverse action against him when the commissioner defers the discipline to the club itself, which we never see. Much like the NBA, the commissioner of the MLB has wide discretion to suspend players. What amounts to just cause gives the MLB commissioner very wide latitude to determine what conduct amounts to just cause to punish a player. The main reason the MLB CBA is not more specific is, like most aren't more specific. It's because situations are very fact specific, and thus hard if not impossible to outline with words that cover every type of conduct and every specific corresponding punishment. Every fight involves different facts, different players with different disciplinary history, and a whole host of different environmental factors. Environmental factors means the history between teams and players that can lead up to a fight or a violent act. There are different agitators that can happen during a game that can lead up to a fight or a violent act. For example, in the Peoria Chiefs v. Daytona Dragons, game tension increased during the game until there was a violent act. On July 24th, 2008, the Peoria Chiefs were playing the Daytona Dragons. So these are farm clubs for Major League Baseball teams. The game involved a few players being hit by pitches that were likely retaliations for other plays that happened in the game. These environmental factors, these agitators. Chiefs pitcher Julio Castillo threw a pitch that hit Angel Cabrera. This resulted in the Peoria manager coming out of the Peoria dugout and started yelling with the skipper from the Dragons. This is a very tense moment. Maybe people are going to rush the field. So during this tense moment, Chiefs pitcher Castillo threw a ball at the Dragons' dugout. Castillo later said he meant to simply scare the Dragons in hopes they wouldn't charge the field. The problem was Castillo was not accurate with his throw, and the ball hit a 45-year-old fan sitting next to the dugout. As a result, Castillo faced criminal charges and a suspension from the league. Castillo was charged with felonious assault. He received 30 days in jail, and he was also suspended by the league 60 days. He never played again professionally in the United States. This is an easier case to see why Castillo faced criminal charges. His conduct that led to the criminal charge had nothing to do with the game of baseball. The fan that was hit by the ball did not consent to a ball being intentionally thrown in his direction as he sat adjacent to the dugout watching the baseball game. Like we saw with Malice at the Palace, the criminal charges stem from conduct that was outside the scope of play, off the playing surface, and involved fans. Player-on-player violence rarely leads to criminal charges in Major League Baseball. As we see on May 29, 2017, an incident between Washington Nationals' Bryce Harper and San Francisco Giants' Hunter Strickland. What happened in this game is very common occurrence within baseball. San Francisco Giants pitcher Hunter Strickland hit Washington Nationals superstar Bryce Harper in the hip with a fastball. This resulted in Harper taking off his batting helmet, throwing it at Strickland, charging the mound, and punching Strickland. This resulted in 0 criminal charges. Although they were suspended, Strickland was suspended 6 games, Harper 4 games, and each player was fined. Why no criminal charges? No criminal charges because in baseball it's common. It's within the scope of consent for a pitcher to intentionally throw a ball at a batter. People might not like it, but it happens. Likewise, it's common for a batter to charge the mound. These are not uncommon occurrences within baseball. If you're familiar with baseball, you know these events are common. As such, if one plays baseball, they consent to being hit by a ball, charged at, and involved in an ensuing physical confrontation. If you don't want these things to happen, don't play. And if there is consent, and the conduct is within the scope of that consent, and the conduct is common, meaning it's not uncommon, then there is no criminal conduct. Uncommon conduct can lead to criminal charges.
If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel.
Fighting is as common as hockey, as home runs are in baseball. I think you could probably argue even more common. The NHL has some of the most comprehensive rules and collective bargaining agreement that deals with the issues of fighting and violence during a hockey game. Article 18 of the NHL's collective bargaining agreement provides the commissioner with wide discretion to issue supplementary discipline for on-ice conduct. This means that if a player receives a penalty or suspension during a game, the commissioner is free to issue additional discipline, including but not limited to a fine or suspension. And the NHL has many rules that deal with these issues. I'm going to go through a few. NHL Rule 46.1 states, and I quote, "A fight shall be deemed to have occurred when at least one player punches or attempts to punch an opponent repeatedly, or when 2 players wrestle in such a manner it makes it difficult for linesmen to intervene and separate the combatants." The NHL rules not only provide rules regarding what constitutes a fight, but it also dictates what can and cannot happen during that fight. Rule 46.6 states, no player should remove his helmet when engaging in a fight. Rule 46.7 outlines what happens if another fight starts after a fight has already begun. Rule 46.10 outlines penalties for if the fight begins before the puck drops. And the final example, Rule 46.13 outlines the penalties related to a player's jersey being removed during a fight. The fact that the NHL has so many rules dealing with fighting is reflective of the fact that fighting is common within hockey. And if fighting is common with hockey, then players who participate in hockey consent to a fight. However, since the rules are so specific as it relates to fighting, it also means that anything outside the scope of those rules is more likely to be criminal. Add to the fact 6 of these teams play in the NHL play in Canada, very peaceful country. As such, some games played within the NHL are played within Canada and some played within the United States. 2 wildly different legal systems, 2 wildly different countries with different social and political views. The prevalence of fighting in hockey and the difference between the United States and Canada's legal systems are why we see our next example, the Bertuzzi-Moore incident. On February 21st, 2004, the Vancouver Canucks played the Colorado Avalanche. Avalanche player Steve Moore fought Canucks player Matt Cook earlier in the game. Additionally, Moore laid a vicious hit on Canucks captain Marcus Naslund 5 days earlier when the teams played on February 16, 2004. These environmental factors are agitating it. Bertuzzi was trying to get Moore to fight him. but Moore refused. Bertuzzi then sucker punched Moore in the back of the head, knocking Moore unconscious and down to the ice where a dog pile ensued. Moore suffered facial cuts, a concussion, and 3 fractured neck vertebrae. Bertuzzi was suspended for the remainder of the season, which included 13 regular season games and 7 playoff games. He was fined $250,000. Bertuzzi was also charged in Canada with assault causing bodily harm, a charge that could have seen Bertuzzi face 1.5 years in jail. Bertuzzi pleaded guilty, received 80 hours of community service and probation. Moore also filed a civil suit against Bertuzzi seeking financial damages, which was settled out of court. This case is somewhat similar to the NBA case involving Kermit Washington. Both cases involve a sucker punch. Both cases involve serious injury. However, there are more differences. The Washington case happened in the 1970s. This case happened in 2004. The Washington case happened in America, and this case happened in Canada. The Washington case occurred in the NBA, and this case happened in the NHL. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, and probably even into the thousands, police they didn't screw around with celebrities or famous people or athletes. The criminal justice system simply stayed out of it. So the timing of these events, in and of themselves, result in one explanation of why Washington faced no criminal charges when Bertuzzi did. The country of Canada is another reason why Bertuzzi faced these criminal charges. The country has a much stricter view of violence than compared to its neighbor to the south. Even though the Washington case happened in the late 70s, I believe if that case happened in Canada during the same time period, there could have been criminal charges. The NHL has very specific rules regarding fighting. None of the rules deal with sucker punches to the back of the head, resulting in serious injuries. If Bertuzzi and Moore were facing each other, and Bertuzzi punched Moore in the face and resulted in the same injuries, I do not believe we'd see criminal charges. Yes, the NHL allows fighting, but has never condoned sucker punches. Moore consented to physical contact when he stepped on the ice February 21st, 2004, when the Avalanche played the Canucks. Moore also consented to being in a possible fight. In fact, he got in a fight earlier in the game. But Moore did not consent to getting sucker punched to the back of the head. The NHL rules do not allow or permit punching to the back of the head. Additionally, the severity of injury that Moore received is a multiplying factor that increases the need for criminal charges. This put together with the fact that the game was played in Canada, a country with a reputation for being peaceful and non-violent, definitely played a factor in Bertuzzi facing criminal charges. From one sport with frequent fistfights to one with, to my knowledge, none. The NFL. The NFL has rules that deal with unnecessary roughness, striking, kicking, kneeing an opponent. They have rules all the way through, specifically stating that use of a helmet as a weapon is prohibited, but none specifically dealing with fighting. These rules allow the referee during an NFL game to penalize and suspend players. However, like all professional sports, the NFL provides an avenue for the NFL commissioner to have wide discretion in fining or suspending a player for, and I quote, conduct detrimental to the integrity of the game of professional football. Historically, there's not been 2 players in the NFL that have taken off their helmets, squared up, and got into a fist fight. There are situations where players punch each other in the helmet when the helmet's still on their head, and when players' helmets are removed and swung at them, but no criminal charges. I mean, we even have a player stomp on another player's head when a helmet is off, no criminal charges. Look no further than October 1st, 2006, Dallas Cowboys playing the Tennessee Titans. Dallas Cowboys center Andre Gurode laying on the ground after a play, and his helmet's removed. After his helmet was removed, Tennessee Titans Hainsworth, who arguably could have been the culprit who ripped off the helmet, stomped on Gurode's forehead, resulting in 30 stitches. No criminal charges, and the NFL suspended him 5 games. That seems like nothing. So let's compare that to a more recent example that happened in 2019. Myles Garrett and Mason Rudolph. On November 14th, 2019, the Cleveland Browns were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Players Myles Garrett and Mason Rudolph were tangled up during a play. Garrett removed Rudolph's helmet, swung Rudolph's helmet, and hit Rudolph. There were no criminal charges. There were no serious injuries at all, but the NFL suspended Garrett 6 games. I don't think anyone would argue that when Rudolph consented to participate in the subject game, he consented to having his helmet removed and used to hit him. However, there was no criminal charges. There was no criminal charges similar to the Harper Strickland and Kermit Washington incidents. All three of these incidents happened on the field of play. Like the Harper Strickland matter, there was no serious injuries. If there were serious injuries, then I think we would have seen criminal charges. It's like that old cliche, no harm, no foul. The Hainsworth incident happened in 2006, and the Garrett Rudolph incident happened in 2019.
In 2006, Hainsworth got 5 games for stomping on another player's forehead, causing 30 stitches. In 2019, Garrett got 6 games for swinging a helmet and causing no substantial injury. With the passage of time, we're seeing an increase in the severity of punishment for violent conduct in sports. As we've progressed as a society, we've become increasingly intolerant of violent behavior. If the Hainsworth incident happened today, I think we would probably see criminal charges and much stiffer suspension, maybe even a lifetime ban. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I appreciate it.